What if the institutions designed to help us understand the human psyche are actually afraid of them? Hosted by Dr. Michael Montgomery, this podcast explores the uncomfortable questions. Together we'll examine how the mental health systems meant to heal us instead perpetuate cycles of dependency. Welcome to the Psychophobia Podcast.
I'm really excited and very grateful that you decided to come on the Psychophobia podcast.
Of course, any excuse for a good chat.
Yeah, the format is basically we just jump straight in, so I don't really introduce you or yet, because I like just to get stuck right into it, okay?
Sounds good.
So with that said, what is this and what does it mean to you?
The DSM-5.
Yeah.
That's a complicated, interesting thing to spring upon me right at the beginning.
I know.
When I see the DSM-5, I do have a visceral reaction to it. Of course, working in the field, it is a manual that is treated like the Bible, when in my perspective, it's really only one of many theories. And it's not as scientifically backed and as research backed as it should be. I take great offense to it being used as the be-all and end-all to describe human distress and people's experiences. However, I also don't want to negate for those people for whom they've found use or helpfulness in a diagnosis they may have received using the DSM, because there are lots of people, maybe not necessarily psychosis. I haven't met anybody who's really embraced a diagnosis of psychosis yet in my time so far. But I do know of others who maybe have embraced a diagnosis of bipolar, for instance, and see it in a positive light. So there are some people for whom it helps them to make sense of their experiences. But I think the DSM, especially in the American context, becomes something much more problematic.
Wow. You covered so much in such a short space of time, and I put you right on the spot. I thought...
You did.
Yeah, where do you start with that? I'm going to jump right in and say you use the word psychosis. What does that mean?
Well, of course, I have to bring up psychosis. So as the executive director of ISPS-US, the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis, US chapter, of course, a lot of my thinking centers around what is known as psychosis. So as somebody myself who's experienced psychosis, and I name it as psychosis, it is a state of mind where you have lost contact with so-called consensual reality, and you may hear things or see things that are not there, or have unusual or problematic beliefs that others may not share.
So I would say, in the spirit of psychophobia, some people might fall off their chair hearing you reveal that you experience psychosis.
Well, maybe. I am quite open about it. So it would actually surprise me if people have been following my work or have watched any of our webinars and I haven't mentioned it yet. But yeah, as a teenager, I experienced a whole lot of different mental health problems and symptoms. And there was a period of my life where I was diagnosed with psychosis. And that was probably the worst period of my life, to be frank.
So, firstly, thank you for being so open. What I meant was people's prejudice around how someone with psychosis or having had psychosis may look.
Now that's very interesting, because now we're getting into the topic of stigma.
Yeah.
And that is something that I'm very interested in. In fact, my master's thesis was on the topic of stigma, specifically self-stigma. So yeah, there are definitely misconceptions. I don't think so much so amongst maybe the groups that we're involved with, but certainly the general public. They have a very fixed viewpoint on what somebody with psychosis might look like. And I probably am not one of them.
So I'm so glad we're getting into this so quickly. I see whatever those labels point to, I see them all on a spectrum. So I would see no difference in terms of admitting I'm struggling with what I might label depression or psychosis, right? But society seems to have graded them in terms of potential levels of stigma. I think a huge door that you opened towards recovery is being open, especially with people who understand and won't judge and won't label and will not negate, which is unfortunately perhaps many of the things that people do experience when they reach out for help.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to guess that you chose to research stigma because perhaps you experienced some?
Well, there's two reasons why I wanted to look at stigma. One is that I was working in mental health services in the UK. I was working in early intervention in psychosis team. And I have to admit, I worked in an amazing team, doing amazing work, and everybody had a very shared set of values that was very recovery focused, very open-minded. We ran hearing voices groups. We did so many different wonderful holistic approaches and treatments as part of that team. However, stigma came to me, one, in what I saw my patients, the people I was working with, dealing with as they were trying to integrate their experiences into their life, trying to get work or dealing with what their family's perceptions was of what helped them, or what happened to them, sorry. But on another side was the concept of self-stigma. So I very clearly saw in those folks, and in myself too, when I was going through this, the idea that when you're diagnosed with psychosis, there's a picture in your mind too of what your life is now going to look like. So I use myself as an example, right? So I'm half Asian. My mom was Indonesian, and Asian parents are very hard on their children. They want their children to succeed, especially immigrant parents. They want you to be a doctor, a nurse, or a lawyer. And so at an early age, it was on the cards that I was going to excel academically and get some high-powered job. When I started to struggle after a childhood full of different traumas, and I was diagnosed with psychosis, all of a sudden it seemed that feature doesn't exist for me anymore. So what am I going to do now? And I recall very strongly, this is a very strong memory for me, thinking I'm just going to work in a convenience store for the rest of my life. And that's not something that it wasn't giving up on myself. I still believed in my own abilities, but I didn't think somebody diagnosed with that, somebody like me, was capable of achieving it. And I was afraid that going down that path would cause me to relapse. So I saw this in the people that I was working with, that they'd come to this existential crisis of, even after maybe the initial acute symptoms had faded, either because maybe some people were medication, for other people that wasn't part of their treatment plan. They managed to, break through and those symptoms died down. But there was still this existential crisis of, well, what now? Because the life I thought I was going to have cannot exist now, because now I'm psychotic. Now I'm a mental patient. So that was why I wanted to approach stigma, because stigma, of course, is deeply problematic when it can stop you getting jobs or relationships and people are actively rejecting you. But I think that is the very obvious side of it. The other side of it is how it impacts us as people when we internalize it.
So nearly like self-stigma?
Yeah, self-stigma or internalized stigma. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. So are you saying that your actual experience didn't make your capacity in your future? It was the internalization of the label and everything that came with that created the doubt?
Yeah, I don't want to make it as clear cut as that, because I think very rarely are these things black and white. There was certainly a time in my life where my quote unquote psychotic experiences were making my life difficult. I was very paranoid, particularly about my family, and doing some quite bizarre things like running into the street at night because I was afraid of being in the house. That isn't conducive to study, to work, to steady relationships because I was, frantic and not able to connect with people or to, stay on the path of the things in my life that brought meaning and self-actualization, like work and education for me. However, once that passed, absolutely the self-stigma that I was experiencing was a major factor in, giving myself permission to continue down the same path I was on or correcting course. Because the kind of expectations that people had of me before and after diagnosis were very, very different. Yeah. What was expected of me is that I would turn up at the community mental health team once a week. The expectation was that I would meet my psychiatrist once a month. The expectation was that I would take my medication every day. And nobody expected that person that was shuffling in and out of the psychiatric clinic, to succeed. I'm not saying success needs to be this capitalized notion of becoming an executive director or getting a master's degree or, those things that I have managed to achieve. But even like getting married or having a relationship or having kids, there's definitely a stigma, a self-stigma you actualize, where you internalize, where you think those things won't be possible.
You describe it so clearly and so vividly. I think it speaks to the journey that you've been on and perhaps the work that you've done. Because if there's one thing, I would like people to get out of these conversations is it's not black and white, right? So I use the word Pharmakon, this Greek word, which means it's a poison and a cure. So I think we share a lot of views. If you take psychiatric medication, for some people it can save their lives. For other people, applied wrongly, it can ruin their lives. You have to reconcile those two pieces of information. Hospital, for some people, can turn their life around. For other people, it can make their life a lot worse. And those are uncomfortable truths. But I think they're truths that we're kind of avoiding because you tend to get, often two extreme camps. One of the things I really respect, value, and love about you, your work, your leadership, is you very much appreciate that there are different views and different experiences, and it isn't black and white. We also have so much in common. I lived in Asia. I lived in Malaysia for 4 years, and I've been in community settings where perhaps I'm talking to one of the adults in a family, and the mother and father come in, and they literally, this is a true story, have photographs of all the other siblings who have all got degrees and successful, and they're basically saying, there's a shame, there's a stigma. So they're saying, we've done a great job on the other children. It's just this one, and right. This one is probably one of the most beautiful, incredible people you've ever met in your life, but they're not like the other three, right? So I saw people get psychiatrized for gender challenges, sexuality challenges, unusual view. It was used in a very, unfortunately, draconian way. It was nearly an abuse. Which kind of reminded me of the sort of literature that I would have read, from the anti-psychiatry movement, 50 years ago or whatever. I'd like to be talking to you today to say I think we've come a long way, but one of the reasons for doing the podcast is I don't think we have.
No, I don't think we have. I think you've mentioned some interesting things there yourself, like in the anti-psychiatry movement, there can be a romanticization of non-Western cultures and how they treat or understand mental distress, emotional distress. And that isn't necessarily the case. I mean, there are some great examples of extreme states being seen as spiritual or gifts, but it isn't actually the case amongst all non-Western society. So I just want to uphold that, being a person myself of, half Asian background, there's almost this fetishization of like non-Western cultures, and sometimes it's actually a lot worse. I do think there has been progress in the UK, where I'm originally from, and in the US, but definitely there is a long way to go, and it feels like a lot of the progress we had made is rapidly going backwards. In the last year or two, I feel like things are rapidly going backwards with the rise of carceral treatments and involuntary treatments and an influx of policies that seek to do that. This is the same thing, because you're viewing somebody's distress or someone's hardships through this lens of illness, and this maternalization of the mental health system, that somehow just being put in a hospital and fed drugs is not going to fix that. When you have a more black and white viewpoint, and you can see that, yes, medication is helpful for some it can completely destroy their lives or kill them, like literally kill them decades earlier than it should have happened. Or with hospital, then we can actually start making change, because this black and white thinking isn't helping anybody, and is causing more division, and is pushing, this extreme end of promoting forced treatment. It's making it more powerful.
So I've been reflecting on this a little bit, and as I've prepared more for the podcast, I realized there is quite a divide. So I was teaching recently, I was teaching a bunch of existential psychoanalysts in training, and I noticed that their interests, I think, veered more towards what I would call the worried well. So talking of a hospital and involuntary this and that, it wasn't of interest. And I thought it drew a parallel to this sort of push to talk about profound autism versus sort of on spectrum autism, because it can be quite an extreme spectrum. The thought of someone who seeks help, and when they seek help, actually they end up being incarcerated or taken away by security and forcibly injected. These are not rare occurrences, unfortunately. I work very much at the harder end, and I'm dealing principally often with the trauma that has been experienced in the mental health system before I even get to talking about what was the presenting issue in the first place. It's harrowing, and it's also very, very complicated, because there are times, and I've witnessed it, when there are people who are in such a state, who don't arguably deserve to go to jail, but are in such a state they need some form of containment. And society is structured that containment seems to be then it's a potentially a hospitalization. Where that those two worlds converge, I think, in America, and what I've witnessed is, if you're in distress in America, certainly in the areas I live, and you phone for services, you'll have an ambulance, a fire truck, which I never understood, and a police car. The optic is not one of safety. If I came out of the house and saw that in America, I would be really nervous. No offense to those hardworking folks in those services, but just in terms of the language that you're using, which is one of people are in a state of distress. They are looking for safety, but they'll have the same level of response that someone who is maybe presenting as needing some sort of containment, because maybe there's, the situation has just got really volatile. How different would that be to the UK, do you think?
Well, I see the British system through two different lenses. One is having experienced it as a patient myself, and being taken to hospital without my consent. And also as a person working in mental health system. So yes, I can see both sides. I do acknowledge that there are times when somebody is very, very distressed, is in imminent danger of ending their life or hurting other people, where a form of containment is needed. I would argue, before I say any more, that once somebody has got to that stage, I believe very strongly that something has failed them prior to that. Things can be done prior to that happening to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So by the time somebody has reached a point of intense distress where they feel so threatened by other people that they are planning and they mean to hurt somebody, or that they plan to end their own lives, I believe there are many missed opportunities that either mental health systems or society at large has missed. For instance, the role of trauma. So if that person, I'm not saying every person who's experiencing things has been through trauma. I think that can be a bit of a trope too. But it is obviously a huge correlation between trauma and extreme mental states. That if that trauma had never existed in the first place, if that person had never been abused, maybe it wouldn't have led to that. That's like the furthest back that could happen. If there was a way of primary prevention to stop child abuse, for instance, we would probably see a lot less instances of people entering the mental health system in a great state of distress, forcefully. However, there's like lots more proximal things, like what treatment has that person received to this point? What has their local community done to support them? What has their family done to support them? And it's not placing blame with other people, but it's like looking back and thinking, what could have happened at this point? And also at the point of crisis, what has been tried? Are we immediately going in there? And again, I speak from experience, someone also in the United States, of the police, the ambulance, the fire truck coming and taking me away, pinning me down.
What is that fire truck for? Did you ever work?
What is the fire, Michael? What is the fire truck for? I have no idea. I had no idea then. I have no idea now. But it's frightening. It's scary.
Yeah.
But they come in there with such force, and they're shouting, and they have no interest in finding out why you're feeling this way. I mean, you could argue that, a police person is not a therapist, so they're not equipped to deal with that. And why are they showing up? Why are they the first line of crisis response? Because my experience was that if someone had just sat and talked to me, it might have taken 2 hours. I'm not going to say it would be quick. For me to feel heard and safe in that moment, probably they would have needed to drag me away. And I'm speaking to, there's many examples that I've seen of other folks, but it's easier to talk about myself because I can tell you how I felt. I'm in a position now of being able to articulate how I felt. And I'm also in this position of privilege of people going, well, somebody who's articulate and who's accomplished stuff like her, they shouldn't be treated that way. But it's not just me, though. We also need to think about the people who are homeless and being dragged away. Something has failed them. Many things have failed those folks prior to that point of crisis. And it's a lot easier to blame them at that point of crisis. They need taken away, they're sick, they're defective in some way. We need to treat them, we are the experts. Then acknowledging we have failed collectively somewhere along the line.
My goodness, you cover so much and such important points. I mean, you mentioned trauma. I set myself a goal when I first got into this area to try and find somebody who was mad. I haven't found them yet. Not when...
Mad people make the most sense.
Well, what I mean by that is when I have met someone who's been labelled a particular way and I've sat down and listened to their story, their presentation made complete sense. It was a way to cope, right? And again, I'm not trying to romanticize it, but I'm saying that there was a hell of a lot more meaning in their story and how it related to their presentation than perhaps a medical model would let you believe. I think you mentioned the ISPS. When I was in Malaysia, I came across that as a resource, and there's a book by John Reed and it just reframed a lot of the ideas, a much more psychosocial approach, and trauma really came into focus. And I think I moved from, what's wrong with you to what happened to you.
Yes.
And now to what you're saying is, what was that like for you? Right. So I think the term psychosis is useful as a very, very broad umbrella, but I would argue it's psychoses, right? There isn't autism, there's autisms, there's psychoses, and from here to Malaysia and back, there is form. So from a phenomenological point of view, I could say there is a form to whatever that word points to, be it a paranoia, for example, for some people, a form of hearing voices, right? But the content in that form is so personalized and so individual and so different. You mentioned, and I agree, the number of people that I have met, first episode, as they call it, psychosis, who I have had immediate intervention and the psychosis has gone, right? But you mentioned sitting down for 2 hours, and we are in a McDonaldized society that's looking for quick results. Average psychiatrist apparently is between 15 and 22 minutes for a session, right? And you're asking to have an encounter. I think it's the only way. But how do we make that case in a society that's looking for quick results? It's very, very challenging.
Well, I think there's a systemic issue at play. So you asked me earlier, looking at the difference between the UK and the US. And I don't want to romanticize the UK either, because many people are also harmed in that system. And I feel myself, especially as an adolescent, that that system also led to harm. Some healing, but probably mostly harm at that point. But I will say this. So the early intervention team I worked for, at no point do we have to diagnose somebody to give them a code to bill an insurance company. It is completely up to the clinician, or it wasn't just clinicians. There were also, like myself, when I was working early intervention, I was what was called a support time recovery worker, an STR worker. So I'm not like a clinician. It was more like somewhere of a peer worker and an occupational therapy assistant, maybe, because there's a lot of like group work and therapeutic activity involved in what I used to do. But, you didn't have to bill for an intervention that could only last a certain amount of time, right? Like it was completely down to you. Like I could literally spend a whole day with a person, getting to know them, building rapport, going out and doing an activity of interest of theirs, trying to re-engage them in things that were important to them. But also in times of crisis, when somebody was in crisis, I could easily spend 2 hours with somebody, talking with them, trying to de-escalate what was happening, seeing if we could keep them in their home, seeing what support they needed, even if it was just, basic needs, like they need some food. And if they had some food and they could turn electricity back on, then they would feel less distressed because they weren't hungry and cold. Sometimes there are very easy fixes you can have that aren't actually a mental health treatment. But the point is that because we didn't have this billing system, it was completely down to you as not just a service provider, but also a human, on what you were willing and wanted to do to support that other human. And I think when we come to this system of private healthcare, again, as you mentioned, there are great people as are working in emergency services, as there are working in mental health services in the United States. But the system itself lends you to not being able to be human to human. It's a consumer model. It's a consumer and a provider model where you're having to bill and money is the bottom line. And that is a huge barrier we need to overcome.
Yeah, I think you make great points. I experienced that myself, the sense of in the UK, because there wasn't the push to code for insurance, it wasn't even necessary to give a diagnosis, actually, unless the psychiatrist was prescribing, which was often. But the other thing that and I'm free associating here, came to mind, when I was on a community mental health team, it was an open plan office. So the psychiatrist was actually on the other side of the desk. So there was a much more sense of parity of esteem. And at the time, for someone to be involuntary hospitalized, the social worker had to sign the paperwork with the psychiatrist. So there was always the counter of the psychosocial. Now, I think that's changed and that's shifted, but I think it was very much a different mindset. In 20 years, I've never had to work towards someone being involuntary admitted. When I did my first training in social work, I refused to go to involuntary hospitalization. I still won the prize for social work, right? Because to me, social work was about activism and protest and trying to make change in the most positive way. It wasn't to collude with a practice that perhaps you saw was wrong. You mentioned again the DSM, which is kind of what we started with. It was fascinating because in the UK, I was trained to deconstruct. So when I came here, I had to sort of reconstruct how to use it. And it, as a broad thing, it has its advantages when you're talking to colleagues. But in its own words, it was never meant to be a formulation, right? And it talks about it in the introduction. It was meant to be one of many, right? So I think how I see it being used is it uses formulation. So you tick the boxes, and then that's what they are.
Right.
They have psychosis. What? So immediately it dehumanizes and labels and puts somebody in a box. As a starting point, as I say, if I was differentiating between someone who presents in a very manic state compared to what I've described as a more psychotic state, I think that's good information, right? As a top broad line. So some of the broad categories are useful, but when it's confused as a method, is confused into truth, then I think that is where it gets into great difficulty, and also the push to bill, billable hours,
yes,
and all that. So jumping back, you talked about your experience. What would it have been like, or what would you have wanted that conversation to be like, rather than phone services?
You mean like in the United States when they get the fire truck?
Yeah, or any of the times when you were in a state of distress and you just needed someone. Tell me what you would have needed in those 2 hours. That might be helpful.
It's hard to say exactly. I think so much it depends on who you're speaking to. But broadly speaking, I would say in times of distress, I've needed someone to sit down with me, to ask me what was going on, what I was upset about, what was distressing me, to validate those feelings, to feel understood and heard, for somebody to have interpreted what I was saying as a form of truth. Not every time that I've been in a state of distress has it been psychotic in nature. Sometimes it's been much more like depressive in nature. But even during times where I wasn't making sense and I was talking about paranoid things, somebody needed to see that as a form of truth, as my truth, that it wasn't just delusions, it was rooted in something, and what I was experiencing was real, even if it was just that sounds really scary. I can see why you're feeling this way, Leah. I would be terrified if that was happening to me. If what you're saying was, what we're saying is happening to you will happen to me, I'd be terrified. I think if they said, I think you've done really well to survive up to this point. If maybe they were able to talk about the things that I have done to support myself and to explore more about that, what was helpful, what was harmful, then we could have come up with a pathway together that was collaborative. Before we spoke, you talked about, I think maybe we should talk about agency. And I was thinking a bit about agency before I spoke to you today when I was walking my dogs through the park for their their afternoon sabbatical.
Mhm.
And I was thinking that in situations like that, agency is so easily lost because the person is coming from this very paternalistic point of view of, if we're talking about psychosis, my reality is the true reality. What this person is experiencing is not the truth. But working with someone collaboratively is giving them agency and acknowledging that even if they're not making sense, it doesn't mean they completely lack capacity, because it might be that, they're not making sense, but they know that being pinned down and drugged is not helpful for them. In fact, it will greatly traumatize them in the future. Or they might know that going to a hospital, maybe it's mixed gender, maybe it's very busy. In a city hospital, ones that I've worked in, also been a patient in, that doesn't feel safe to them because of whatever's happened to them in the past. So the collaboratively can come together of, okay, the situation isn't manageable as it is. We need to change something. There might be something we can change that will actually help the person rather than just contain them and further harm them, pushing them further away from mental health services, and becoming less trusting. And maybe even, I know from my experiences and the experiences that I've seen from other people when they've been through this, they might even stop believing that they can get better, because every time that they reach out for help or provide them with help, it makes it worse. And eventually you might think, nothing can help me. And that's a very sad place to be in, because there always is something that can help you.
Well, it speaks to the iatrogenic nature of care. It's not necessarily intentional, but it certainly can be the consequence, where the systems think this is what we are doing to actually help someone, but actually that very help is what's exasperating and making it much, much, much worse. So it sounded like what you're describing as an experience, and this is how I talk to people about it. It's very, very, very real, but it may not be true. So it's like someone crossing a bridge that's very high up, and it's absolutely solid and safe and, engineeringly perfect, and, hundreds of people go across it a day, and they try and cross it and they're absolutely petrified with fear. That fear is absolutely real. It's pure and it's real, but it may not be true in the sense of the bridge. At what point did you realize that, or what shifted it from, and I'm assuming that it shifted from, yeah, it was real, but I could see maybe some of it wasn't as true as I thought it was. What changed that, or did that ever change?
Well, in my case, it was distance from the triggering people and circumstances. So I had to remove myself from the environmental and personal triggers that were making me feel unsafe. That was very important. That would not happen, like I say, like I have trauma in my past where being in a busy inpatient ward just exasperates it. But there was also things at home that were causing me stress that I needed to kind of figure out with my family and the people close to me. But equally, it was finding, I had a very good therapist. I really credit the therapist I had in my late teens as saving my life. And it was because she saw me, she validated me, and I felt nurtured by her. And that was quite a different experience of what I had received, at least through crisis services, or even in very busy community mental health teams that, wanted you in and out and just, tick boxes. Are you hearing voices? Are people broadcasting thoughts into your head? Like even like phrased in very clinical ways that a person experiencing these things, they think people are broadcasting something into my head. You don't think of it that way. You think of it much more organically, right? But I don't want to, UK services aren't all universally great either. But yeah, having a therapist that I could sit with and I saw weekly for 2 years, her influence, the care that she gave me and that feeling loved and supported made a huge difference to me. And that to me, that can be a friend, that could be a family member. I believe that. But for me, it needs to be someone separate from me. It needs to be someone that didn't tell me they cared for me because they were my family member. It needs to be someone else, because then I could believe them more. That they didn't have a duty or role to care for me. They were somebody else.
So you mentioned the tick box. There is no form or tick box or module on a training course that I've ever seen that says love and support. And you also mentioned the word care. When I did a significant piece of research with 20 senior therapists, what I learned from them over their decades of experience, it was like something like 600 years of experience. What I learned from them inadvertently that seemed to work was explicit care. Right. So when the patient knew that the therapist truly actually cared and could communicate that, not hide behind a desk or a title, that was where the healing and the if you like, the trick was, once they knew this person cared, then they could access care for themselves. They could access their own value. There isn't a tick box for that, because actually it's a numbers game, right? You mentioned, the going to the community mental health team. And again, no offense to anyone in that environment. I've been in that environment. It literally is a tick box form, right? Now, some people can memorize it. So they can ask the questions that are going to go on the form in a way that doesn't look like it's a tick box, but it is absolutely a tick box because it has to be fed back into the computer. And we put people in boxes we think we understand, right? There is no form long enough to try and capture the beauty of the difference of the individual that is presenting. I'm going to jump back and say, you were very, very lucky. You had good experiences on an early intervention team. My heart was about early intervention. I thought that is where it was going back 20 years. And I should say I came from the corporate sector. This was second career, but I was on this early intervention team, and I remember being I was horrified, first of all, by what I was seeing and the use of medication to medicate what I would say we needed a conversation. So I was in the team meeting and I said, where is the Hearing Voices group, in this network? And the lead psychiatrist said, our job in this team is to eradicate voices. And I thought, and I ended up, I've had to do this several times in my journey. I just had to leave because there was nowhere to go with it, because he quoted nicely. I was challenged in his prescribing. Always a bit of a troublemaker. And, he pointed me to the NICE guidelines, which for listeners is sort of the Bible of best clinical practice or evidence-based practice in the UK. But that was kind of shocking. And it showed me the power dynamics, because if you got a couple of individuals who saw things in a particular way, they could hold that whole system hostage. Whereas if you had a more open person who was into the ideas of more psychosocial and whatnot, then you could bring it in. But it's a challenging, and you've mentioned a few times, you are potentially up against the system. But just by structure and by order. So when I talk about McDonaldization, it's not that McDonaldization is wrong in and of itself. Efficiency, accountability, these sort of things are can be positive and helpful, but not at the expense of the human, and not at the expense of the individual needs of people. I unfortunately see it getting worse rather than better. I was in a community clinic for 3 years, and I saw McDonaldization come in more and more powerfully every day at the expense of great clinicians, at the expense of people who would see the individual and be able to encounter them as an individual. They're under such pressure to do the numbers, to turn it around, to keep the session exactly to the time, and that. What has your experience been in contrast between the UK and America in terms of McDonaldization and healthcare generally?
Well, I think you pointing out your negative experience working at an early intervention team just shows that the British system itself is very varied, and it can depend on what NHS trust you're in, and it can just depend on literally the people that are hired. So the team I was on had various psychiatrists across the years. Sometimes we had an allotted amount of time from the psychiatrist who headed like the south of the city and CMHT, or the north of the city. So we, like, half a day a week, they would see our patients around. And so some of those people were exactly like that. Like, my goal is to eradicate the symptoms, even if it means completely destroying somebody who has, quote unquote, treatment resistant schizophrenia with clozapine, even though clozapine wasn't doing an ounce of difference. It wasn't helping them in any way. It was just, causing them all those physical health problems. But my God, they were going to stick with it to the bitter end. And the bitter end, sadly, would mean, I wasn't there for decades, but the bitter end would mean somebody passing away earlier from all the metabolic and cognitive and all these other issues that we know are a part of antipsychotic medication, particularly at high doses for long times. So in terms of this McDonaldization that you're talking about, people who are operating in that framework are very much going to see it as a tick box exercise, because that's the only thing they're interested in. In the US, I think, again, it's the billing system that leads people to be that way. And there's also this, I'm not sure if it's the same in every state. I was in Indiana, but having therapist friends, if a person didn't show up to their appointment, they couldn't bill. And therefore you have to kick them off your books after 3 no-shows, because, the system needs to keep chugging along and getting money. But the person that doesn't show up for sessions is probably the person that needs the sessions the most. They need somebody to reach out for them and be there for them. And it's indicative that what they're being offered there isn't working for them. Maybe it's a therapist they're not connecting with, or a therapist that's legitimately bad because they don't care, or they're burnt out. Or I do think the majority of people working in this field are wanting to help in some way, but over time that can become very difficult and a drain, particularly if we're feeling we're not actually supporting people. But the system isn't set up for this longer term of engagement. Like, for instance, talk about McDonald's. I could think of 2 of my people I work with, patients of mine, that I felt I had the best possible relationship with. But it started from literally taking them to McDonald's, buying them a burger, sitting and chatting about the football match last night, and that being our engagement for periods of time before we could start doing therapeutic work. And I think this whole concept of McDonaldization...
was that not therapeutic work in itself? Well,
I don't know. McDonald's, I'm not the biggest fan.
But in terms of the encounter, in terms of just being with...
No, exactly. And then feeling like, they knew I wasn't a friend, but I was a friend because I did actually care for them. I was very interested in them as a human being. They were interested in me, and I would share the things that I felt able to share from my own recovery journey, if that was appropriate about my own life, if that felt safe and appropriate for me. But we were connected. You can call it friendship, you can call it therapeutic engagement, you can call it what you like. But having that opportunity to build that in a natural or a more natural setting, the fluorescent lights and ingredients in McDonald's, I'm not saying are the most nutritious to the body, but in terms of nutrition for the soul, connecting with somebody at a place.
I'm going to get sued.
Maybe you will, I'm sorry. But that, you can't imagine that existing in the American system. Maybe you could when it comes to services working outside the system, more like peer support services or mutual aid programs. I don't necessarily think it's what background you come from. You can come from a clinical background, you come from a peer background, you can just be a good friend. What makes good therapy is that connection, that relationship, and that love that you can give somebody.
No tick box for love.
No tick box for love. But this is also why I went into occupational therapy, is because, this idea of eliminating symptoms at all costs to me was nonsensical, because somebody can have symptoms but find a way around them or integrate them or learn to appreciate them in some level and live extremely fulfilling lives. And so occupational therapy gave me that perspective and that way forward, as in it doesn't really matter someone's diagnosis. It doesn't matter necessarily what symptoms they're experiencing. It's the impact they have on their life and the things that they want to do that matters.
Very powerful. A sidebar, I do love Freud the thinker, not necessarily Freud the psychoanalyst, but, I'm paraphrasing here. He talked about psychoanalysis being a cure through love, which a lot of people are surprised to hear. I remember a patient recently said, he basically said, I love you. And I said, well, I kind of love you or I wouldn't be able to do this work. And that's not how I would have been trained. That would be a no-no. But I said it because it was authentic and it was also true. And I think that truth and that authenticity is more powerful than, a technique. You said something very important there about someone being on a high dose of medication and it not working at all. Why are they on it then?
Because all treatment-resistant patients, please, I'm using that term. I find it an offensive term because I think that's a lot more complicated than it sounds. Because all treatment-resistant patients should be on clozapine. That's the last line of treatment. But why? I agree with you. Why? Why should anybody be on medication that isn't helping them?
So
just because they're diagnosed with psychosis? I think this really is a psychosis-specific phenomenon. I don't think we see it as much with depression, anxiety or other diagnoses. But when it comes to psychosis, the only legitimate form of treatment is medication. To me, that's false.
In my experience, it's false because I've worked with many people who haven't been on medication and experienced a recovery. I'm going to say, state for the record, because I think we've talked about this, we are very much in the camp of 3 pillars. So we're not against medication, but believe doesn't necessarily have to be the first place you need to go.
Absolutely.
We're against higher doses of medication than people need to be on, and we're against people being on medication long term when they don't need to be. Not anti-psychiatry, right? But anti-bad psychiatry. Huge difference.
Yes.
Collaboration, informed choice. So if this podcast is about anything, it is about informed choice. I should say, I came from the corporate sector into the mental health sphere, and I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, right? So I had no agenda, no informed background, but watching how people were treated in London, particularly people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, people of colour predominantly, how they were treated within this sort of forced medication system, the really poor results, right, that I was witnessing, again, with what I use this term virgin eyes. I didn't know, just what I was seeing. And then most frighteningly, the side effects of the medication, which R.D. Laing, thankfully I picked up a book on R.D. Laing, it taught me are not the side effects, they're the effects of the medication. And I don't mean to be sexist anyway, but I saw people who looked as beautifully as presented as yourself 1 month, and then seeing them literally at an unhealthy weight and unrecognizable physically 3 months later after a period in the hospital and heavy doses of these very, very potent medications. I just couldn't understand it. And then when I saw people under community treatment orders who basically, if they didn't accept the medication, they would have to go back into hospital, I felt that was kind of torture. And again, not being dramatic, the World Health Organization has recently described involuntary treatment and restraints as a form of torture. So what do we do to try and change this? Because to me, it's self-evident. We could be doing a lot better. how do we change? I'm sure a psychiatrist going, oh yeah, it's very well said for you two people sitting in your comfy chairs, but we're at the front end. People are brought to hospital by the police in these elevated states. What do you suggest? You mentioned homeless people, right?
Yeah.
Do we just let them, you see the images of, say, San Francisco and these safe spaces where people can inject fentanyl. Do we just let them inject themselves to death, or do we as a society make any intervention? Now, it's at the extreme end, but these are real questions that people might come back. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, going back to what I said earlier, I think once somebody has reached this point of being homeless and injecting fentanyl and talking to themselves in the street and, thinking of the absolute worst case scenario, we have to acknowledge that something very wrong has happened in the past for them to reach this stage. There are many opportunities we've had in the past to intervene. I would say the most horrifying difference to me between the US and the UK, the US isn't all terrible. I don't mean to spin it that way. I've also seen some incredible work going on. But what was hardest for me as a helper and a helping profession was to go from a system where people's basic needs could be met through comprehensive welfare systems. Again, not saying that the UK's got it perfect, and it's definitely not perfect now, and it's ever eroding. But let's look at this scenario. So before working at ISPS, I was working at my local YWCA leading domestic violence programs, which included the domestic violence shelter, which is essentially a homelessness shelter. I saw many people who are chronically homeless and who were experiencing very complex emotional problems. Often people who were experiencing what seemed to be paranoia. Sometimes it would be hard to pick out because, that person has legitimately been under threat, but it seemed to spiral into something much more broad, conspiracy-based perhaps. And the hardest thing for me going between these two systems was, at least in the UK, I could, think of Maslow's hierarchy. This person right now is homeless. They need a home. I will get them housing benefit. Therefore, they could be housed. Now it's a universal income. So a universal income would be housing, but also not just food stamps where you go in and you can only buy food, but an amount of money that they could get whatever their needs are, the things that help them feel better. It could be food, it could be, whatever. It's like a leisure activity they could use their benefits for. And so using that meager, but still fairly comprehensive welfare system meant I could get these folks who are in really tricky, complicated situations into a place where they could feel safe, where they're fed, and they may even have a little bit of additional money to do things that they enjoy that bring them a sense of identity and purpose. That wasn't possible in the US. So these people that have very complex problems, they could never get out of the shelter system. And in fact, the shelter system in itself is extremely stressful. So a person who's experiencing paranoia living in a communal shelter environment may often get into disagreements with other people around them or feel threatened by other people because of what they're experiencing, particularly if they have trauma, and therefore become excluded, kicked out of shelter systems. It's because the shelter system was never the answer in the first place. So I know that's not mental health specific, but I'm saying once you get person once they're able to get into a safe space, this is very much a housing first model, then you can begin to work on the deeper mental health problems. And in fact, a lot of those things that they're experiencing may ease a huge amount because they're not in a dangerous environment anymore. So it seems, honestly, I can't find the sense in it. I'm completely baffled why we're thinking that the answer to homelessness, particularly chronically, mentally ill, homeless, again, I'm using the phrasing that they use, not because that's the phrasing that I, believe in. It's ridiculous to me that we think the answer to that is throwing them into hospital, injection with drugs that may or may not help. Some people it may help, but some people it does not work. throw it out the system and thinking that they're going to want to keep engaging. It's never going to happen. And they're not getting housed. So we need to think broader than what's happening in the desk in a psychiatrist's office, to think about the person's whole life context.
So I agree with a lot. I had an epiphany along the journey where I remember seeing someone who had been labelled depressed. They were middle-aged and they'd just been made redundant, and there's financial issues and the term depression was meaningless without looking at those things first. It's like, perhaps you're not psychotic, perhaps you were brutally abused, and this is creating some sort of meaning to help you cope with the unlivable. But there is a tension here, because the question, and this has come up for me recently, right? And it's back to kind of, it took me to the brink of my experience and beliefs, right? So you have somebody who is not engaging with services, who presents with what you would say episodic psychosis, is also extremely neurodiverse, which is another thing we could touch upon, and potentially they're putting themselves in kind of life-threatening situations. So if you go back to the fentanyl user, are you saying that agency is primary, and that if that person is choosing to use fentanyl, the best we can do is give them clean needles and a safe space? I know it's an extreme example, right? But it's a true example. So is the person who's refusing treatment. Do we just let them? What do we do as a society? Is the answer?
Well, I know this isn't. I don't think fentanyl use in and of itself is a reason to involuntarily hospitalize somebody. But if we're talking about that, maybe this person also has very clear mental health difficulties as well. My personal belief is not completely against all forms of, I don't want to say involuntary treatment, but treatment like a hospital or an environment where somebody may not be choosing it as their first line, but the environment that we put people into, this is what I'm trying to say. If they are like actively trying to hurt somebody else or actively hurting themselves, by that I don't necessarily mean drug use. I mean, they've got a gun to their head. I am not so far down the agency primary that I don't believe we should take the gun from their hand and put them in an environment where they don't have a gun. I do know folks who are like that, and people should have agency to take their own life if they want to. I find that a little bit, I think it comes from my own experiences of having suicide attempts and being glad that I didn't succeed, that I come from this point of view. I'm not saying that there isn't a possible situation, a very extreme situation, where somebody needs to be put somewhere, to receive some support. However, the environments that we put people into are not conducive to providing that support. Like I say, hospitals are very often scary and dangerous places. What's being offered is maybe seeing a psychiatrist and being prescribed something. My own experience of being in a psychiatric hospital was seeing the psychiatrist when I came in, and then once a week. And then the only other thing to do within that time is watching daytime television in the smoking room. It wasn't a therapeutic environment. So if there are very rare, much rarer than is currently happening, situations where somebody needs to be in a hospital, those places need to be much better thought out, much safer, and be providing actual approaches that support people. And then there are pipelines afterwards where this isn't the be all and end all. The goal isn't to get someone on medication. The goal is to get someone stable. So more crucially than metaphorically taking a gun out of somebody's hand is setting them up for success in their lives and figuring out what that looks like for that individual.
You describe situations, the idea is, in some wards, you reduce all stimulation, and that's meant to be kind of helpful. My experience was often people in wards didn't get any engagement because the idea was if they were engaged with it would make things worse, which comes back to the sort of the history of psychiatry, and how psychosis was actually viewed. But I'd mentioned, neurodiverse. I mean, you had mentioned, a trauma background and being in a busy ward and environment. For some people, some of those experiences are so triggering that the triggering response can look like a mental health issue when actually it's how they organize the world and how they feel safe in the world. And I'm seeing those two really intersect in a really, really bad way within the system. But again, I'm tortured by this idea of agency because I really believe that there is more agency in psychosis than we as a society realize, and as the individual perhaps realizes. And it's leading people to the point where they can see they have more agency, I think is so central. But I should clarify, when I think of radical agency, and what I mean by that is avoiding what I would call the Sartorian bypass. So it's not like agency is you're choosing to use fentanyl or you're not choosing to use fentanyl. No, radical agency is about embodiment. It's about context. It's about structure. It's about neurobiology. I might decide that I want to stop using fentanyl, but my body mightn't allow it, right? Because it's now wired in a dependency point of view. But if you go back to your own experience, how would you describe your agency when you were at your worst? When by your own words, you said you were very paranoid. How much agency would you say you had in that moment?
I don't think I saw myself as having agency at that time because I was already in the mental health system. I didn't enter into the mental health system at the culmination of this. I was already in the mental health system and things weren't getting better and then culminated further. So I think by that stage, I already felt I didn't have a lot of agency. That at times I felt like an annoyance to my care coordinator in my mental health team, or like the therapist I'd tried before I, found a really great therapist, didn't really have time to listen or weren't getting what I was saying to them. And psychiatrists I felt were reducing my experiences to a diagnosis rather than like understanding the context of what I was talking about. So all of that eventually strips away your agency. And I do think that some of the more bizarre things that I was doing was an expression of agency. I mean, like running out into the night was like, I want to be free. Like it doesn't make sense to me now. It didn't make sense to me then. I don't know why I was doing these bizarre things. But if I'm trying to think about almost like the primal reason, like right deep in my brain, why was I doing these bizarre things, was like, I want to be free. Or I'm scared and I'm trying to find somewhere safe. Which is also like a form of agency because I'm leaving my home, which was where I was supposed to be, and going away from the home, which I wasn't supposed to. So that was an expression of agency. I would think that for me and for many other folks that I've encountered, that rediscovering your own agency is the key to recovery, because you're not expecting someone to heal you. You're realizing that you have a life worth living, that you have a future, that you are capable, that you are resilient, that you have skills. All of these realizations is a rediscovery of your agency. Because when we rely on psychiatrists to make us better, we're going to be sadly disappointed, because that is not really what moving forward from distress is. Maybe it does reduce symptoms for some folks, but it's not going to put your life back on track. What puts your life back on track is you, and also the connections and relationships we have with others, this interdependence that we have with others. I'm not talking about it's only an individualistic thing, but we can find that agency also exists in the relationships we have with others, in the relationships and contact we allow others to have with us. And if you come from a trauma background, that's all the more important, because maybe the interactions you've had with others have not been consensual or have hurt you in some way, and they want the interactions you wanted to have. So being able to find healthier relationships or to connect with others where you can express that agency is also key.
I'm feeling kind of emotional because you kind of described what I feel is my life's work. So everything you just said is everything that I believe and the work that I'm trying to do. People get very upset with me initially because perhaps in groups or individually, I will say, no one is coming. And people have said to me, it made them really angry when they first heard it. But then when they found their own agency, they were liberated. Because what I realized, Leah, was when I first saw people, I would say, my job is to make myself redundant. I don't want to be a therapist. I want to live in a world where people don't suffer. But I learned so much about the mind with a small m and a big M. I felt that I could help people come back to a place where they find confidence within themselves to kind of, in a way, self-heal. But that's not the way the system was geared up. It was geared up that actually I'm not helping somebody find themselves. I'm helping somebody become dependent on my help, on my dispensing of a pill or my weekly therapy. And through the research, what I discovered was, by their own admission, people were saying, actually, what we do is we make people feel comfortable. So you're in distress, you pay me, you come along for an hour a week, I make you feel better, you go away. What I was saying was people were talking about being afraid of their depression or their psychosis. Why would you be afraid of your mind? It's your own mind. What have you been doing in use the word treatment, where you haven't discovered this, where you haven't discovered empowerment and self-efficacy? And then I realized that, and not everyone, right, but by many clinicians' own admission, they need people to come back, right? If everyone has self-efficacy, they wouldn't be needed. Now, there's great value going to spend time with anyone who will witness you and listen and talk, but I want people to be free, and I think agency is absolutely central. What I felt was the other reason for psychophobia, underneath what I call fear of the mind, is fear of suffering, fear of grieving, fear of mourning. So to take somebody through a journey and to support them, often it gets worse before it gets better. That's not the way modern therapists are trained. They're trained to fix and to do, right? The thought of being with someone in McDonald's as having value in terms of connection and encounter and all the great things that you said about your therapist that were very, very real, right? That you don't describe a dependency. You describe someone who saw you enough for you to regain your confidence in yourself, right? That self-efficacy is everything. But I am seeing a system that pushes out the idea of recovery and hope and self-healing and connection. And as you say, connectedness and community, all those things are very, very important. But I think the self-belief that someone is okay and it's going to be okay, and they can learn the triggers and the things that make things not okay without becoming dependent on someone else for the rest of their life.
All of that, all of the above, I subscribe to that. But I do want to say something. So I know very much this is your life work. We've had many great conversations that haven't been recorded. I do think there is legitimacy to a level of psychophobia. I do think there's legitimacy to being afraid of your mind. My mind has led me to states of mind that have put me into very dangerous situations and have completely derailed my life. Even now, I would be afraid if I was thinking that I was relapsing in some major way. However, as you say, that having self-efficacy has been key to me taking control of my life. What I think needs to happen, that what we need to make happen as a society, is this acknowledgement, but also understanding that doing this work, as you say, good therapy is not comfortable. Good therapy to me is like, you've got a wound that's healed badly, that's all like gnarled and scarred. Good therapy, you have to like cut that sucker off and like sew it back up again. It's like very painful to go back to the things that have been done to you or hurt you, or if you don't have a trauma history, like, you know, what's happening in the present that's causing you harm, making you feel stressed. And to be able to do that work, you need to be in a place of safety. You need to be in a place of physical safety, which means your basic needs have to be met. And you also have to be in emotional safety with somebody. So that doesn't mean that every mental health professional is capable of providing that. If they're in this for the wrong reasons, or they're not in a position to be able to really witness and see somebody and care for somebody. Because if you're just treating people as a conveyor belt of consumers, you're never going to be able to provide them that emotional safety where that work can take place. Somebody isn't going to gift you that. I really feel like somebody who's received therapy, not only am I receiving like a service and a gift from the therapist, I also feel like by revealing myself as a full human is also me giving somebody something of me. And I'm not going to give that to somebody unless I feel safe with them.
Yeah, very powerful. You said something really profound, and you've said many things, but one of the reasons, other reasons I wanted to do the podcasts and talk to incredible people like yourself was to refine my own thinking. So you made me stop and pause there. I think you make a really good point about fear. There's times to fear the mind, but I think it's more of you have to know your mind. You have to be brought into an experience of your own mind to know at times when there's difficulty. It's a bit like I meet incredible people who you might describe as quite mystical, right? And they're able to tell you they might get signs from water, right, that are very positive and wholesome for their life. And there are times when the signs from water take a malevolent turn, take a darker turn, or a turn that's more persecutory, and they know something has shifted. I think if someone is able to be supported to come into relationship with their own mind, then they have agency and can know the steps that they have to take, rather than things are out of kilter. I need someone to come in and help me, right? Which they may do. But the move, I think, is towards a point where someone is more confident to understand what is going on for them, and that they can actually get through to the other side. But I'm going to think about that a lot more. I think it's a really, really important point. I'm going to have to factor it in. I'm really conscious of time, right? I could just keep talking to you forever. I'm such a huge fan. I think you are such an incredible leader, such an important voice in this space, not least of which because you aren't black and white. You understand the complexity and the nuance. Let's speak quickly before we finish about the ISPS-US. I want to give you space to talk about that, because I think it's an incredible organization, which I am a member of and support. Such a colourful bunch of folks I've never met in my life, especially at the conference, and people I have learnt so much from, and I'm absolutely indebted to. People, especially people who self-identify as survivors. They've taught me so much as a person and as a clinician, and I'm endlessly grateful to them for that. Tell me about your role and the organization for those who don't know.
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say that anything I've expressed in this podcast are my own opinion and not that of my organization.
Fair enough.
Because this is, that's a cheesy disclaimer, but comes to a more interesting point is that ISPS is a membership organization that also provides education, but that is what we deem a big tent. So within that organization, there's a full gamut of belief systems and types of experience. So some people may be completely abolitionist when it comes to the mental health system. Some may have more mainstream beliefs. I think the thing that links us all is this belief in dialogue and wanting to learn and understand all different perspectives and approaches to quote unquote psychosis, and understanding that it all has value and purpose. So I enter the organization. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm a person of lived experience. I've worked in the mental health system and also in the homelessness systems. But there are also people who are like leading peer support networks. There are people who are psychiatrists. There are professors. There are researchers. There are family members who are desperate for different types of support for their loved one. And I think we all acknowledge that what we have in the US, the system that we have, the approaches that we have are not enough. So we're coming together to exchange ideas, experiences, to debate, to dialogue, to bring in best practices, to bring in novel thinking in order to revision what the mental health system could look like. And I've met so many people through my work. I've now been with the organization for 4 years that have completely changed my mind about things, that have opened my eyes to new ways of thinking, that have challenged me in the best possible ways. And I feel like every day that I'm working at my job, I'm forced to re-examine the things that I believe in. And I think that makes me a better person, not just a better clinician, not just a better professional, not just, a better person going through my own experiences, but it's making me a better human, because we're having to, tolerate uncertainty, to understand there are multiple truths and to understand the significance of all of it. And that's one thing that I love about ISPS.
I love that. That's such a great description. And I would say, I wholeheartedly agree. Just been as a member, I left out families. I have learned so much, and I'm indebted to families. Completely challenged what I thought I knew about mental health, the mental health system, just from witnessing the impact on families and working with families and people desperate for some sort of support. I get quite a few people who'll reach out to me in desperation, but they've come through ISPS. Their loved ones have kind of been through the system and they're kind of stuck. What are your goals and aims for the organization in the next 12 months? What should we be excited about?
We'll have our annual conference, as always, in the fall, and that's always a really exciting time for us to come together and to be with one another and to share our ideas and learn from one another. So we're currently looking at different venues across the country, so I'll be able to release that soon. We're about to launch a series that's going to be looking at quote-unquote negative symptoms and what that means. Just from preparing for this series and meeting different speakers, I've already, like I say, challenged my own perspectives on what is traditionally seen as a deficit model into more adaptive ways of thinking about it. And it will also look at different like clinical approaches, different types of assessments that someone could use. But again, with this quite critical mindset of looking to expand what has been a very neglected area, I think, of thought, even within our own communities, which is focused very much on, the meaning behind positive symptoms and neglecting to focus also on what are called negative symptoms. And we are also looking at advocacy work. So we've recently been involved in supporting the Informed Consent Act, which is specifically looking at making sure that veterans involved in the VA system have to give informed consent before being given potentially dangerous medications, including antipsychotics, which is why we have become involved in that. Because I hope that what I've expressed over the course of this conversation that we've had is that informed consent is key. Yes, there's those 3 pillars where not anti-medication, but medication should be the least amount possible for the least amount of time possible. But fundamental to that is informed consent, where that person can give consent to be given it. So we look forward to being engaged in more advocacy projects like that underscore our values.
It's very exciting. It doesn't sound like it's a lot to ask for informed consent, but I believe that the most recent attempt at getting a bill through was denied.
It's in the balance right now, so I believe it's still being worked on.
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested, I'll put it in the show notes. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal about polypharmacy and veterans. I do a lot of work with veterans, and I've met a lot of these key players. The stories are extraordinary. It's a great case study just to show how far in the wrong direction we've come in some of these areas. Okay, listen, I'm really conscious I've kept you so long. As I say, I could probably do another 4 hours. I am indebted to you as an individual and the contribution you make in the space, but also as a friend, and all the guidance and keep me on the straight and narrow. Is there anything I should ask you that I haven't, or anything that you wanted to say that you wanted to get in that we missed?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you as always, and I also consider you a friend and a thought partner. So I'm so grateful to you and to all the other amazing people I've met in this space who, continue to help me grow.
I always feel I've grown, and I most of all I feel really inspired after talking to you. So it encourages me to keep going. So thank you.
Keep going. We all have to keep going. That's important. We have to. Yes, we have to keep going together, because I feel like we're at a critical momentum, and more people's eyes are being open to the fact that our current system isn't working. So we have to keep supporting each other in this work.
Yeah, I think we are at a point in time. Definitely a raising of consciousness in the most positive of ways.
All right,
okay.
Well, pleasure.
Thank you. We will speak soon.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.